Today I have a special discussion in store. We have the executive producer of the new film in theaters now, Nefarious, Steve Deace. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, David. How are you?
Doing great. Now, I have worked some time in radio. I think the first time I saw you was at a Talkers Radio convention. Did you speak? A lot of those probably you've done, right?
Oh gosh, that was a long time ago, but yeah, that was about
Yeah.
a decade. That was 10 years ago. Yeah.
Wow. Well, very good. It's great having you on the show. And I think that it's exciting to see folks who can take different media, radio, cinema, and go in between. I like that. So you're a talk radio host. Tell folks a little bit about your background and then how you got into producing this film.
You bet. I host the show after Glenn Beck on Blaze TV, which is a pretty an enviable spot. It's a little bit like, back in the day coming on Thursday nights on NBC after Cheers. You kind of have a built-in audience there, so it makes your job a lot easier. I do that show from noon to 2 Eastern each day for the Blaze. And about 7, 8 years ago, I wrote a book called A Nefarious Plot about a demonic takeover of America. I meant for it to be kind of a sequel homage to the C.S. Lewis classic, The Screwtape Letters. And this is actually how I originally met Glenn. I didn't know him before. He reached out to me about 6 months after the book was released and said, I thought it kind of had already had its run. It was a modest success. And he's like, hey, I read your book, man, and it blew my mind. And I want to have you on my show to talk about it. And, I really ruminated over whether I should let 10 million people know about this book I wrote. And then after much consternation, I decided to go ahead and do that. And so I was on Glenn's show and driving around that day in Burbank, California, were the guys that were about to form a company called Believe Entertainment. They had helped write PureFlix's biggest hit. They were the script writers for God's Not Dead. And they were getting ready to start pre-production on their first film, which was the Abby Johnson memoir of her time at Planned Parenthood called Unplanned. But they were all very interested in the topic of spiritual warfare. They'd always wanted to do a movie on it. And they were just, fascinated listening to me talk about this book. So they went and got it themselves and read it and thought, yeah, at the very least, that character would make for a good movie. And so they contacted me about the movie rights, and the rest, as they say, is history.
So what was the time span between the book and the film release now?
So the book came out in March of 2016, and then our film was released April the 14th of this year. So a little bit more than 7 years.
Wow. And I've heard you describe it as a battle to get it out the door, right?
I mean, there's been a lot of spiritual warfare, a lot of battles to get this movie made. First of all, to get it distributed, to get it into theaters, to get it to stay in theaters, our own health. We've had, counting what occurred this past weekend, there's now been a grand total of 8 car accidents involving some member of our producer team or crew since we started this movie. We've had 3 separate hospitalizations for serious health issues. I mean, it's been absolutely insane. What has gone on behind the scenes of this movie is almost as compelling as the movie is itself.
Did you film any of it? You should be making a documentary as we're talking.
Well, we are there is, the problem is it keeps happening, but we did compile some of this for the making of features for the DVD later this year. But, even just, in the last, here's what's gone on since last Friday, just last Friday. Last Friday, I was about to speak in New York State. I had been cleared after being treated with a MRSA infection, which had me in the hospital the week prior. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, I start spiking really bad fevers, and they have to call 911 when it gets up to 104. And they don't know yet. It's either a really bad allergic reaction to the antibiotics, or the MRSA has came back and gotten into my bloodstream. And because of how serious the second option is, they have to keep pumping me full of these antibiotics until the blood culture comes back that tells them whether it did get into my bloodstream or not. And of course, these are antibiotics that if it's not in my bloodstream, I'm allergic to, which means they're just, I'm getting poisoned one way or the other, basically. Okay.
Sounds like a medicine.
Turns out the culture was negative and it was a bad allergic reaction. And so we ended up stopping those antibiotics and the fevers. But, that was 24 hours of hell,
Hope you're eating
frankly.
some probiotics right now. You should be stocking up on some of those.
Well, I'm an active probiotic
Good.
user.
Good.
MRSA don't care about your probiotics.
Yeah.
It's like one of the deadliest bacteria on planet Earth.
Wow.
But
Oh my goodness.
But then 1 hour after I got out of the hospital on Saturday afternoon, one of our producers, Chris Jones, texted me. He was putting his infant son, Judah, in his car seat in a parking lot. Out of nowhere, this SUV sped by, nearly hit Chris and killed him, took his car door off, totaled his car.
Wow.
The next day, another one of our producers, John Sullivan, texted me. You're not going to believe this. My car was just parked out front here. Luckily, nobody was in it. Nursing student comes down the street, had fallen asleep, hits my car and totals it.
Wow.
That's all gone on in just the last week. So that's just but a taste of what it has been like to bring this movie and this story to the country.
Wow. And you said there was another car accident too? What was that one?
Yeah, that was the second one. John Sullivan's car accident. Yes.
Wow. My goodness. And John Sullivan's a tough guy. I know him. I know he tells a story where he battled a sea lion, I think, while he was swimming in the ocean one time. So
that sounds very John Sullivan. I'm going to buy that. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm glad to know you guys are well. All these things, what evil can do is obviously only going to be done with God's approval, right? So God's testing or maybe showing you his providence in all this, right?
Well, that's the thing. That's the other thing. I think that's such a good point, because a lot of times we don't talk about spiritual warfare enough, frankly. And then when we do, it's often only from the direction of what the darkness is doing to us. I mean, another way to look at this, I texted both John and Chris over the weekend. All the devil did in the end is buy you guys brand new cars.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So nobody got hurt, totaled your cars. You guys are just getting new cars. He gave me, I got healed. So, I mean, if you look at you can flip the script on all of these things. Both of our directors went into the hospital during Delta variant with COVID pneumonia. And if you know the history of that period of time, man, it was literally a flip of a coin if you went into the ER for COVID, if you were coming back ever again, let alone if you were post 60, as both my directors are. So everything that the enemy intended for evil here, like Joseph says to his brothers, which you intended for evil, God used for good. All things work together for the glory of God and for that which is called according to his purpose. And so our movie is a living testimony to that.
What do you think is the most subversive thing to evil in the film? You don't have to give away any plot or whatever, but whatever you can share, that the evil forces don't want people to see or know about.
Excellent question. One of the things that I point out in my book, A Nefarious Plot, is it's a lie that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing us he doesn't exist. It's a line often attributed to the Unusual Suspects movie from the 90s, but it's much older than that. You don't stand up to God Almighty, shake your fist at him, as the prophet Isaiah talks about Lucifer. I will ascend. I will be like God. I will be like the Most High. You don't shake your fist at God right to his face and then decide, but these mere mortals intimidate me, so I'm going to operate in the shadows. I don't believe that at all. I think what the devil wants is control of his branding, control of his narrative. I mean, right now in our culture, there's more devil than we've ever seen. Whether it's Lucifer as an anti-hero on a Netflix TV show, whether it's Sam Smith performing at the Grammys, what the devil does want is control of his own messaging, his own branding, his own narrative. And what our film does in total is it tells the truth about who he is and what it is that he really wants and what he really thinks of us and what they really intend to do to us. And I think that's why we're seeing these obstacles. If we had done just another, some preteen girl's going to climb up a wall, creepy, and some little kid is going to have, get scars on his body and projectile vomit. We don't do any of that stuff. If we had done that stuff, then I don't think we'd be seeing nearly the resistance we're seeing. The reason that we're seeing this is because this movie tells, and it does it in a very subversive way, as you put it, but it tells the truth about who the enemy is, what his plan is, what they think of us. And that's the truth that the enemy doesn't want out there.
You mentioned the more dramatic stuff. There's the other movie about demons in theaters right now, the Pope's Exorcist. Any comment on that?
No, other than when they tell you in the movie, it's a that it's a cross between The Exorcist and the Da Vinci Code. You need to know right away what that movie really is, And I think frankly, a lot of gullible Christians went and saw it because it had the Pope in the title. And then they went and saw the film and saw what it was really about. And you've seen what's happened to its numbers basically since opening night. It had a very strong opening night. And then that film has just collapsed in terms of audience ever since. It's because the movie is, it's not realistic. It's the story Hollywood wanted to tell, but it's not the actual story to tell.
And would you want Russell Crowe to play you if the story of your making of this movie becomes a movie one day?
Well, I don't know. I mean, is it Maximus Russell Crowe? Or is it the one who gave us the Jaime Jimenez voice last summer as Zeus planning his orgies and whatever the hell that was in Thor: Love and Thunder last year?
I didn't even know. Yeah, I didn't know about that. Wow,
it's time for the orgies. It's time for the I mean, that's literally watching Russell Crowe. I mean, dude, yeah. Do you need a paycheck that bad? Honestly, wow. Have a shred of dignity left. Okay. But so it depends on which Russell Crowe we're talking about.
Yeah. So the movie is more of a psychological approach to demonic activity, correct, not splatters and stuff, right?
Which is to say a realistic one.
Yeah.
Father Carlos Martins of the Exorcist Files said this was the most, he's one of the leading exorcists in the Vatican for the last 20 years. He said this is the most realistic portrayal of demonic possession he's ever seen. And we've heard from, prominent Protestant ministers like Greg Locke and others who do deliverance ministry. They're like, this is really what goes on. It's not the histrionics. Sometimes you see that stuff, but a lot of times that's just to scare people. And if you've done this before, if you're a priest who's been in that battle before, you just don't scare as easily. What demonic possession really does is put you in the Kobayashi Maru, the no-win scenario. It's 7D chess intellectually. Essentially to trap you into a corner so you think the only way out is to give in to what it wants. And you see that depicted very accurately in our movie.
Yeah, that's what Hostage to the Devil by the great Father Malachi Martin talks about, how every one of the possessions that he chronicles in the movie are very often cerebral attacks and intellectual battles about deep philosophical theories. And it's so shocking when I encountered that text when I did, because I was like, wow, I had no idea the level of philosophical and intellectual discourse is taking place in the domain of possessed people and what people are experiencing there.
Right on. And one of the things that I think people don't understand too, there's this idea, because the most famous depiction we've ever seen of this is The Exorcist from 50 years ago. And, this poor 12-year-old girl just gets inhabited playing by an entity named Captain Howdy playing a Ouija board in her mom's basement, right? But the reality is that your will has to assent to this. You have to acquiesce. You have to consent all the way through. We point that out in the movie. There's even stages of this, and you have to consent to each stage. And so this is what makes delivering people from these very difficult, is because a bond forms between you and the entity until the entity reaches the stage of dominion over you that it no longer has to pretend to be anything other than malevolent. And a lot of times when you go, when clergy go to deliver people from these things, they don't really truly want to be fully freed of them. They just want to go back to the earlier stages of inhabitation where maybe they were, they were just kind of lucky, or things were kind of happening for them because these entities were making that happen to ingratiate themselves so that you would keep consenting until they ended up with dominion over you. And you have to be in a state that you truly want to be completely free and completely rid of it. And I think that's a metaphor for where we are at culturally right now. I think there is a small group of Americans that are absolutely sold out to the darkness and the spirit of the age and are trying to impose it on us. I think there's a small group of Americans that recognize what it is that they're trying to impose and are trying to fight it. And then I think there's a really large group of Americans in between those two tribes who think too much of the darkness is icky, but I kind of really want to hold on to the idols that I enjoy. And really fight against your idols, because your idols are ones that don't do anything for me. So I want to take your idols away by holding on to mine. And of course, that's a recipe for failure.
That's very well said. And I think that it describes the left versus right problem we're in today. And I heard in your talk with Eric Metaxas, you talked about how you've kind of having this brush with death that you overcame through God's power. It shook you up about your priorities in terms of looking at politics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. One of the things, I heard in that hospital, and I've got heat rashes, allergy rashes up and down my body. My temperature is well into the hundreds. I'm burning up, and yet I just felt this compulsion that night that I had to just get up, rise, and walk. And so I asked the nurse, "Can we detach some of these two IVs for just a little while so I can take a little bit of a walk?" And they're always worried about blood clots in there when you are sedentary for that long. So they said, "Sure, but we'll keep an eye on you in case you get dizzy, and only for a few minutes." So I ended up walking for 3 hours. Wow. I ended up walking over 9 kilometers in this C-shaped wing, observation wing at this New York hospital. And it was a very powerful evening and encounter. Unlike I'm not one to say God spoke to me. That's not my native theological bent necessarily. But that night he did. And one of the things that I clearly heard in my spirit, and when I say heard, I didn't get like an email or, it wasn't a light with a voice speaking audibly. But something I clearly heard in my spirit is, "Stephen, I need apostles and not assassins." And a reminder that many of the things, well, let me quote one of my favorite lines from Augustine. "There are many sheep without, but many more wolves within." Everybody that's on the wrong side of light is either a sheep or a wolf. And a sheep just doesn't know and needs a shepherd, needs to be tended to, cared for, nurtured. A wolf doesn't want to know. A wolf knows what it is doing. And many of our countrymen that are engaging in these choices that are bringing us to the brink of ruin, frankly, societally, are doing so because they're acting on their own worldview.
Yeah.
They are convinced that they are doing what is right. And we have to remember that many of them are sheep. And such as once were all of us too. We, at some point in time, were on the wrong side of light too. And the good shepherd came to us to bring us into the light. Yeah. And I think that is something that is going to be very important for us to remember moving forward. We cannot Fox News watch our way out of this. We cannot vote our way out of this. That's kind of the boomer political paradigm. Be the silent majority, which means you don't do a damn thing except on election day, and you get out and vote after Fox News makes sure to tell you to. Now, there's a lot at stake in between. I'm not saying don't vote. I think I've been active in full time in political consulting activism for more than a decade, but it's no substitute for the gospel. And we're at a place now as a society that we're beyond political solutions. What's happening in this country is at a very meta and granular spiritual level.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When I started my radio show in WFLA Orlando, I would do promos where I'd say, "I'm your political exorcist," and I would talk about these things. It was kind of a tongue-in-cheek homage to Rush Limbaugh's Doctor of Democracy. Well, we're past the doctor; we need an exorcist now.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
But it's true.
I would say right now, I'm not trying to save America. I'm trying to defeat it.
Yeah.
Whatever it's become is that we don't need to conserve or save this. It needs to be stopped.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think what you're saying is very true. And I want more conservatives to hear your message on this. This is the powerful thing here, which is that, laughing or mocking the left's insanity is not how you solve the problem. If someone is schizophrenic, you don't go into a room and say, "Hey, you're crazy. You're stupid. You're nuts. Right. What you see is insane," But the other, so it's like a dialectic, right? And you can't fall into the dialectic. the left establishment says, no, the schizophrenic person is now going to be accepted as the standard view of reality, and you're going to be
Right.
evil if you don't accept that he's saying spiders were on the wall and they're not there, but you're going to say them, they're there, or else we're going to kill you. And then the right says, no, he's crazy. It's like, no, that's the reaction that we can't do anymore. We have to be like Christ and come to the person possessed by Legion and love them and not mock them, and not fat shame them if the left is idolizing the obesity or whatever. That's dialectical reactionary, right? And when you're reacting, you're not in the driver's seat of history. You're not in the driver's seat of culture, right? If you're reacting to the left saying, I don't like the way you're driving, well, that makes good clicks and you can make good advertising revenues for gold and whatever, but it's not actually going to change like the culture. And to be in the driver's seat of history means you've got to give a forward positive vision so that people say, you know what? I don't want to follow the gods of the city anymore. I want to go out in the wilderness where the wild God is,
I mean, that's very well said, David. Very well said. I mean, but you answered within your own eloquent soliloquy there why this isn't done more often on the right. It's just not good for business, frankly. Reactionaryism is very good for business. It is very good for clicks. It's good for audience. The guy who said, suffer for each other, die to gain or to live, lose to gain, be worried more about the beam in your own eye than the speck of dust in your brother's. That message wasn't popular either. We hung him on a tree for that. That didn't get a lot of clicks either. Yeah. And so the message of I'm self-righteously better than the people I'm opposed to, that's very popular. And the problem that we have, and that's always been the case. Here's what's not always been the case. We are now a full generation into an uncatechized, undiscipled era of our countrymen. The church just has simply not taken the catechesis and discipleship of the people seriously. Forget discipling the nations. It hasn't taken the catechesis and discipleship of its own parishioners seriously for the last decade. We've gotten guys in Hawaiian shirts and pleated khakis and, nicer than God sentimentalism. And so we built a lot of Pottery Barn-esque monasteries in the suburbs, and we sold a poop ton of books, man. But we haven't made a dent in this culture whatsoever. And so I think that a lot of believers, frankly, don't even know how to do what you're talking about because they haven't been properly discipled. That's why they watch so much Fox News. That's their disciple now. I mean, Fox News is basically a parachurch organization that has stepped into the breach. And that's why if you ask a lot of Christians questions like, well, why do you think government programs for the poor are bad? They won't give you some like catechized answer on spear authority and jurisdictional authority and God set up set up spears for state, for the government, for family, for the church. They won't give you any like some John Lockean, or Jonathan Edwards breakdown of divine social order from Calvin's Institutes. They don't even know what Calvin's Institutes are. Okay. Right. Instead, they're going to tell you, well, they're inefficient and waste money. Okay. Why would they give you that answer? Because they got that from Fox News, man. Yeah. And that's the reality. I mean, now we're in this position where, it's very Lord of the Rings-ish, where the gates of Mordor are open. The Black Gate is open and the orcs are flooding out. And, we're these hobbits, basically, that aren't trained for any kind of battle at all. And yet suddenly at this tipping point moment of history, we have to join this like fellowship, all right, to go and we're just not ready for it. And yet, if you read your Bible, those are often the moments though where God shows up the biggest.
Yeah. I'd say that Jesus is like those 90s and 80s movies like the Little Giants and Mighty Ducks, where you've got the worst team ever, but the greatest coach, Right. And the team's got bubble gum and snot hanging down their nose, and they're fumbling and bumbling down the field, but he somehow, through true grit and his spirit, creates the best out of their weaknesses and allows them to win. That's what Jesus is dealing with. He's got the worst team in the world to execute his rescue mission for the world, to save the world, to not make the world that's the problem. Again, I think a lot of this comes from an eschatological perspective where people feel like Everything's going to hell. And I'm like, no, Jesus is winning. Jesus is going to win in history. And every cross follows with the resurrection. And right. And if you think that things are bleak, therefore there is no hope for the gospel, you haven't read the gospel, because that's what the whole point of the structure of history as it pertains to that. So I want to ask you, as someone who's working in radio and as someone who's doing film, these are things that a lot of folks would love to do. How do you see your responsibility moving forward? This movie, I want folks to see Nefarious, check it out, and let me know what you think of it, and the feedback and the comments, and share it with friends, because I think it's opening up a very important topic. But how do you see your role in this new moment of truth that God gave you when you were walking in the hospital? How can you share the feeling you felt about the world and the meaning of life to others around you? What will that look like differently going forward?
I've spent a good deal of time. I've been off this week, just kind of recuperating after, 2 serious hospital visits, and, being admitted and everything else. And just really felt like I needed to get a few days away from the culture war and just try to get my mind right again. And so I have spent the last few days thinking about that very question. And when I started my show years ago, my prime directive, to use a Star Trek phrase, my prime directive was, I wanted to do with the gifts that God has given me. I wanted to do for a biblical worldview what Rush did a generation ago for conservatism. And Rush used his prodigious gifts to bring conservatism into the mainstream of American thought and media again, to the point that literally every major American radio broadcast group wanted its own iteration of him, both on a network level and on a local level in every community across the country. And I wanted to hopefully play some small role in that happening, to bring a biblical worldview back into the mainstream of American thought again. And over the last few years, it's that remains the main prime directive of our show, and always has been. But as I've been involved a lot in politics, I've worked for presidential campaigns and things of that nature, you learn a lot more of the nuts and bolts of the process, and you want to impart that to your audience so that they're smarter consumers. At the same time, though, that always ends up taking the place of something. And I think one thing I'm going to rededicate myself to that prime directive and be more intentional about that prime directive. And if there's something I think that this generation is sorely lacking, because of the lack of catechesis and discipleship that has come from, too many of our churches, for every, I'll just throw a name out there. There's others, but for every John MacArthur, there's 10,000 other guys in sweater vests, that are their idea of a sermon is 5 steps to a greener lawn. Okay, and so we need Francis Schaeffers in this era. We need people who can take a biblical worldview and apply it directly and applicably to the issues of the era, and interpret those topics and issues through that lens. And so that's always been a prime directive of our show. But I think I'm going to, when we return next week, we're going to start being even more intentional and direct about it.
Wow. What do you think? What is the meaning of the firing of Tucker Carlson for you?
The weekend before he was fired, he went and gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation, when he openly talked about spiritual battles, and that this is spiritual darkness that we're up against. And in the end, worldview is destiny, David. Worldview is destiny. No man rises above their own worldview. Out of the heart, the mouth speaks. And in politics, sometimes you have to settle in an imperfect world. Sometimes you do have to settle for transactionalism. Sometimes, transactionalism is definitely preferable to no actionalism. Okay. But understand, though, eventually you reach the worldview fork in the road. Eventually, the cost of doing what is right, when I don't truly, really, inherently, intentionally believe in it, becomes so high I just can't pay it any longer. And I think that's what happened to Rupert Murdoch. I think the cost I don't think guys like Rupert Murdoch get where they're at because they think they make it a habit of losing $2 billion in a week. But that's what he lost last week. He lost $1 billion paid out to Dominion. Then he lost another $1 billion in stock value for News Corp after the Tucker Carlson news. But I think he just reached a breaking point. I think that sort of direct spiritual appeal from Tucker, I think that's a bridge too far from the guy that was lobbying Mitt Romney to openly run on gay marriage in 2012. And in the end, you can't rise above your own worldview. In the end, Rupert Murdoch's made a lot of money off of people like us for the last 25 years at Fox News. But now that the darkness is becoming so prevalent and it's becoming increasingly clear what we must do and discuss in order to confront it, his worldview won't comport with that. It just can't align with that. And I think that's why he pulled the plug. The cost of doing what was right had reached a price point that his worldview was no longer willing to pay.
Yeah, I think so too. And it seems like the end of an era for cable news being a relevant medium for the truth.
Yeah. And the average Fox News viewer for the last decade has been 68 and a half years old. Yeah. So we were coming to this tipping point. Just, time waits for no man. We were coming to it regardless. But now when you look at the growth of companies like ours at the Blaze, I mean, the Daily Wire's had explosive growth in the last year or two. The growth of these digital platforms now is going to increasingly make linear cable irrelevant.
What about radio? Radio is always talked about like the redheaded stepchild, and even, it's always forgotten. But yet that's a big piece of what you do, right? So how does radio fit in? Can radio remake itself and become something that's electric with energy like it was? Because they've been thinking radio's been dead for how many decades? Yeah, especially, AM radio and all these other things. But how do you see the radio mix playing into this? Will it always be continually seen as kind of like a legacy? We keep the roast beef on the menu or something for the elderly group, or is it going to be something where it's like, no, actually it can be remade into a whole new experience again?
I think there's always going to be a desire I'm driving around, tornado sirens go off, turn into the radio and find out what's going on with the weather. Yeah. I'm in a traffic jam on my way to work. All right, tune into the radio, the local radio station for the traffic. I'm on the way home from the game and my favorite team, I'm pissed we just lost and I want to vent. Tune into the local post-game show and listen to the callers and maybe call in myself. I think there will always be, and that's an intimacy that radio provides that almost no other media does on a local level. I think there will always be some form of market for that. How big of a market there will be for that, I don't know, but I think there will always be some form of market for that.
Yeah. So you think the future probably would be more closer to the digital front, like what the podcast and the video on demand?
On a mass level, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, very good. I really
all those radio towers are expensive, brother. Yeah. Very expensive.
Yeah.
Not that expensive to flip on your iPhone and hit record and just start talking.
Right. It's one of those things where the technology just truly can't compete with the efficiency of another technology.
Right.
Yeah. I think what you're doing is exciting, and I hope we'll see some more films. But I want, again, folks to check out Nefarious, and I look forward to hearing the debates and dialogues that are sparked because of this. I mean, it's interesting. This movie came out, and I didn't know this was the timing of this, but I've been interviewing a lot of exorcists and, Father Vincent Lampert and other folks around the Holy Week to investigate spiritual warfare. And then Tucker comes out and says that speech about spiritual warfare, and your movie's out now. So it's a big topic. And I think it's a great opportunity to hopefully to show the reality of these things and to understand that, people can be possessed and nations can be possessed. And, when I look at pictures of children, these teenagers and so forth, that their faces they make after they regret mutilating themselves, you can see it looks like a victim of possession, a malevolent entities, and not necessarily possession necessarily, but entities are causing them to do great harm to them. You can see it in their eyes.
Influence. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Wholeheartedly.
So I appreciate you doing it, and we will continue to follow your work and look forward to hearing the new direction you take with your message as you turn towards the spiritual world more.
You got it, brother. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you.